Since Neil Armstrong took his famous small step in 1969, humanity's arrival on the moon has become an undeniable milestone in science and technology. The Apollo 11 mission, broadcast to millions of people worldwide, symbolized the United States' victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. However, over the decades, questions have arisen that challenge the official narrative. Suspicious photographs, inconsistencies in NASA's records, and even possible image manipulations have fueled the idea that this achievement may not have been exactly as it was told. Amid contested evidence and theories shrouded in mystery, one question remains. Was the moon landing truly a feat of humanity, or one of the greatest hoaxes in history? Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I am Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for your help. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, but it makes a huge difference in helping YouTube deliver these videos to more people and allowing me to continue bringing this content to you. I'm counting on you. Let's get into the video. If there's one thing science understands very well, it's the behavior of light. And when we talk about the moon, an environment without an atmosphere, where the only source of illumination is the sun, the logic is simple. All shadows should be parallel. But when we analyze some of the photographs taken during the Apollo 11 mission, something doesn't add up. The shadows intersect, form strange angles, and appear completely inconsistent. Could this be just an effect of the moon's topography, or an artificial lighting error? Many have tried to justify these discrepancies by saying that the moon's uneven surface could distort the direction of the shadows. And in fact, small variations in terrain can create optical illusions and make a shadow appear at a different angle. But does this explanation apply to all the images where this phenomenon occurs? Or are we looking at a mistake in a possible stage setting? Now pay attention to this detail. In some photos, astronauts appear illuminated even when they are completely in another object's shadow. How is that possible if there was no other light source? NASA explains this by saying that the lunar surface reflects sunlight, but think about it. Would the reflection from the ground be strong enough to fully illuminate an astronaut? And there's more. Some photos show objects in the background with perfect lighting, as if they were being hit by an extra light source. This would make sense if there were reflectors in the environment. But as we know, there weren't any. So where is this light coming from? If you think that's strange, wait until you hear this next part. Some images of the moon landing show shadows of completely different sizes for objects of similar height. How can that happen if the light comes from a single fixed point? The sun doesn't change position in a matter of seconds, so why do these shadows seem so inconsistent? Another suspicious detail is the fact that, on the moon, shadows should be extremely sharp. In the vacuum of space, without an atmosphere to scatter light, the edges of shadows should be well defined, without smooth gradients. But that's not what we see in some images. Some shadows appear blurred, with soft transitions between light and darkness. Do you know where this effect happens? In film studios, when multiple light sources are used to create a more realistic scene. And here's another curious point. Some of these Apollo 11 mission photos are identical to tests NASA conducted on Earth before the mission. And when I say identical, I'm not exaggerating. The positioning of the shadows, the angle of the light, everything matches. Is this just a coincidence, or was it a possible leak of material that was never meant to be seen? Now here's something not many people know. NASA has admitted that some images were altered before being released. Officially, this was done to improve image quality. But if some photos were manipulated, how can we be sure that the rest of the material wasn't also adjusted? What else might have been altered before being shown to the public? And here comes the big question. If these lighting errors were truly definitive evidence of a hoax, why haven't scientists and experts officially confirmed it? Well, think about what happens to anyone who challenges NASA's official version. Conspiracy theories are quickly discredited, and anyone questioning the moon landing is labeled a lunatic. But does no one in the scientific community have doubts? Or are they simply not allowed to speak about it? In the end, these shadows that don't make sense could just be a natural effect of the lunar environment, or they could be the most obvious flaw in a grand theatrical production staged right here on Earth. What do you think? Everyone has seen that iconic image of the American flag planted in the lunar soil, a symbol of victory, of conquest, but also one of the biggest sources of doubt. If the moon has no atmosphere, how can the flag be waving? This detail alone makes many people question everything that was shown during that mission. NASA insists that the flag never moved on its own, and that the wavy effect happened because it was folded inside the capsule before being extended. And yes, it makes sense that a folded fabric would have creases. But what about the videos? Because when we watch the Apollo 11 footage, we can clearly see the flag moving right after being planted in the ground. The astronauts had already let go of the pole, and yet the fabric keeps oscillating. How is that possible if there's no wind? The official explanation is that the flag was simply vibrating after being planted. Since there's no air on the moon to dissipate energy, the fabric would have oscillated longer than it would on Earth. Okay, that makes sense. But then why does the movement continue in some images even when no one is touching it? That shouldn't happen. And what if it was just a technical mistake from a staged studio scene? And here comes an even stranger detail. Take a close look at the flag. It wasn't made like a regular flag. A horizontal pole was placed at the top to keep the fabric stretched out, since there's no wind on the moon to keep it open. But even with that support, the flag was never completely straight. On the contrary, that ripple remained the whole time. Was it just a design flaw? Or was that ripple intentional to give the illusion of wind where there shouldn't be any? Now, what happened to that flag afterward? When the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter passed over the area where the astronauts landed, the shadow of the flag was still there. But there's a problem. The intense radiation of space should have faded or even destroyed the fabric after so many years. How did something that wasn't designed to withstand the moon's extreme conditions simply remain there, intact? And there's something else. During the later Apollo missions, the flag was photographed again, and something looked off. The fabric, which was previously rigid and held up by the support, now looked deflated, as if it had lost its structure. But wait a minute, there's no wind on the moon, no humidity, nothing that could have caused the material to deteriorate like that. What happened there? Skeptics believe this is evidence that the flag was swapped out or removed when they realized the mistake in the simulation. If the landing was filmed in a studio, any error could have forced NASA to reshoot the scenes, and any forgotten detail could create inconsistencies in the images released later. Is that what happened? Now look at the mission videos. When we slow down the original footage, the movement of the flag looks identical to how fabric waves in an environment with air. So the question remains, are we just seeing a misunderstood physical phenomenon in a vacuum, or a recording made here on Earth? With each new analysis, the questions only grow. What really happened there? Was the waving flag just a misunderstood phenomenon, or a recording mistake that was never supposed to be noticed? For such a monumental event as the first moon landing, one would expect every detail to be carefully documented, archived, and preserved for posterity. But strangely, some of the most important recordings of the mission have simply disappeared. What could justify this? How could something so valuable be lost? Or was it hidden on purpose? In 2006, NASA itself admitted that the original tapes of the Apollo 11 transmissions had been erased and reused. That's right. The only high-quality recordings of humanity's first landing on another world were recorded over, as if they were old, unimportant tapes. And the given explanation? Lack of storage space. But does it really make sense that the most advanced space agency of the time would simply erase, out of carelessness, historical records that could never be recreated? This is not the only strange case involving mission documents. Some transcripts of conversations between the astronauts and mission control have also disappeared or were edited. At certain moments in the original broadcast, communication was cut off without explanation. For a full 2 minutes, not a single word was transmitted to the public. The official justification was a temporary technical failure. But what could have happened during those 2 minutes? Conspiracy theorists believe that, in that moment of silence, the astronauts were reporting something that couldn't be heard by the whole world. Some anomaly? Something unexpected on the lunar surface? What was NASA trying to hide? And here comes an even stranger detail. Neil Armstrong himself, the first man to step on the moon, avoided talking about the subject for the rest of his life. Unlike other astronauts who loved to share their experiences, Armstrong rarely gave interviews and refused to discuss details of the mission. In a rare public appearance, he used an enigmatic phrase to describe the Apollo mission. There are great ideas yet to be discovered, ideas that are protected by layers of secrecy. What did he mean by that? Another curious fact is that the original designs of the lunar module Eagle have also disappeared. The engineering blueprints, technical documents, and calculations that allowed the spacecraft to land on the moon were simply lost. NASA claims the documents were discarded because they were no longer useful. But how could such revolutionary technology be treated so negligently? And it doesn't stop there. The original negatives of the photographs taken on the moon are also missing. What we have today are only digitized copies, with no way to verify the authenticity of the original material. Were these images altered before being released? The most intriguing part is that these disappearances didn't happen with other space missions. The recordings of Apollo 12, 14, 15, and the other lunar expeditions were preserved without any issues. But for some reason, the most important records of Apollo 11 were lost. Does this seem like simple carelessness or a deliberate attempt to hide something? Many believe these absences are more than coincidences. If the moon landing was a hoax, erasing the evidence would be the only way to ensure no one could analyze it too deeply. Photographs, videos, audio recordings, and even technical documents, everything that could be examined and questioned simply vanished. In the end, only questions remain. Were the files erased by accident or for convenience? Were those minutes of silence during the broadcast just technical failures or revelations that were never meant to be heard? Returning from a historic mission should have been a moment of celebration. The first moon landing was broadcast to millions of people worldwide, a feat that forever changed the course of human history. Now imagine, after experiencing something so monumental, you'd expect the astronauts to be euphoric, excited, full of pride. But that's not what happened. When Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins sat down for their first press conference after the mission, something seemed off. None of them smiled. None of them looked happy. On the contrary, they appeared tense, uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact and giving short, hesitant answers. What could explain this behavior? The trio had just returned as global heroes, yet they looked more guilty than victorious. Watching the recording of the interview, it's impossible not to notice the heavy atmosphere in the room. When journalists ask questions, the three astronauts glance at each other, as if checking what they could or couldn't say. At several moments, they hesitate before responding, as if treading on dangerous ground. Is this the expected behavior of people who had just accomplished one of the greatest achievements in history? And here's the most curious detail. When asked what it felt like to see the moon up close, Armstrong responds in a strangely vague manner, as if describing something he had never actually seen. Buzz Aldrin looks down, avoids the camera, fidgets nervously with his hands. Even Michael Collins, who remained in the command module orbiting the moon, seems far too uncomfortable for someone who wasn't part of the landing itself. But perhaps the strangest moment of the press conference comes when a journalist asks if they could see the stars in space. Armstrong and Aldrin take a long pause, exchange glances, and finally give a confused explanation. First, they say they don't remember, then that they didn't pay attention. But how could that be? Trained astronauts, scientists, in an environment completely different from anything they had ever experienced, and they simply didn't look at the stars? The mystery doesn't end there. Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon, became one of the most reclusive figures in space exploration history. Unlike other astronauts who traveled to space and loved sharing their experiences, Armstrong avoided interviews and rarely spoke about the mission. In one of the few occasions he appeared publicly, he made a speech in which he said an intriguing phrase: "There are great ideas yet to be discovered, ideas that are protected by layers of secrecy." What did he mean by that? What was hidden behind these layers of secrecy? Buzz Aldrin also displayed at least peculiar behavior over the years. He once stated in interviews that he saw something strange during the Apollo 11 mission, but always refused to go into detail. On other occasions, he seemed disoriented and uncomfortable when talking about the landing, as if carrying a burden he couldn't share. And then comes the inevitable question: were the astronauts tense because they saw something on the moon that could never be revealed, or because they had to sustain a story that never actually happened? Returning from a historic mission should have been a moment of celebration. The first moon landing was broadcast to millions of people worldwide, a feat that forever changed the course of human history. Now imagine, after experiencing something so monumental, you'd expect the astronauts to be euphoric, excited, full of pride. But that's not what happened. When Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins sat down for their first press conference after the mission, something seemed off. None of them smiled. None of them looked happy. On the contrary, they appeared tense, uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact and giving short, hesitant answers. What could explain this behavior? The trio had just returned as global heroes, yet they looked more guilty than victorious. Watching the recording of the interview, it's impossible not to notice the heavy atmosphere in the room. When journalists ask questions, the three astronauts glance at each other, as if checking what they could or couldn't say. At several moments, they hesitate before responding, as if treading on dangerous ground. Is this the expected behavior of people who had just accomplished one of the greatest achievements in history? And here's the most curious detail. When asked what it felt like to see the moon up close, Armstrong responds in a strangely vague manner, as if describing something he had never actually seen. Buzz Aldrin looks down, avoids the camera, fidgets nervously with his hands. Even Michael Collins, who remained in the command module orbiting the moon, seems far too uncomfortable for someone who wasn't part of the landing itself. But perhaps the strangest moment of the press conference comes when a journalist asks if they could see the stars in space. Armstrong and Aldrin take a long pause, exchange glances, and finally give a confused explanation. First, they say they don't remember, then that they didn't pay attention. But how could that be? Trained astronauts, scientists, in an environment completely different from anything they had ever experienced, and they simply didn't look at the stars? The mystery doesn't end there. Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon, became one of the most reclusive figures in space exploration history. Unlike other astronauts who traveled to space and loved sharing their experiences, Armstrong avoided interviews and rarely spoke about the mission. In one of the few occasions he appeared publicly, he made a speech in which he said an intriguing phrase: "There are great ideas yet to be discovered, ideas that are protected by layers of secrecy." What did he mean by that? What was hidden behind these layers of secrecy? Buzz Aldrin also displayed at least peculiar behavior over the years. He once stated in interviews that he saw something strange during the Apollo 11 mission, but always refused to go into detail. On other occasions, he seemed disoriented and uncomfortable when talking about the landing, as if carrying a burden he couldn't share. And then comes the inevitable question: were the astronauts tense because they saw something on the moon that could never be revealed, or because they had to sustain a story that never actually happened? The entire world watched as the first man stepped on the moon. But did everyone really hear everything that happened during that mission? Some parts of the transmission were cut, certain audio recordings disappeared, and crucial details were never released. What was in those communications that couldn't be heard by the public? During the descent of the lunar module, something unexpected happened. The communication between the astronauts and mission control was interrupted for a full 2 minutes. 2 minutes might not seem like much, but in a mission like this, it's an eternity. Far too long for such a silence to go unnoticed. The official justification was a temporary technical failure. But does it really make sense that at the most critical moment of the mission, the audio just happened to fail? What was said during those 2 minutes that couldn't be broadcast to the world? And it doesn't stop there. You know those conversations we hear between the astronauts and NASA? What many people don't know is that there was also a private communication channel, an emergency system that allowed the astronauts to speak without the public hearing. But what exactly happened that required a private conversation, hidden from the rest of the world? Now brace yourself for something even stranger. The original tapes of the Apollo 11 transmission simply disappeared. That's right. In 2006, NASA admitted that the high-quality recordings of the moon landing had been erased and reused. Reused? How could something like this happen? We're talking about humanity's greatest achievement, and someone, by accident, recorded over the original tapes? Does that make sense to you? And the issues didn't stop with the audio transmission. During the mission, strange noises appeared in the communication, metallic sounds, unusual interference, something that didn't seem like just a technical glitch. Engineers who analyzed the recordings classified some of these interferences as unidentified. What could have caused these noises? A simple anomaly in the signal, or something that wasn't supposed to be there. Another curious detail: the video transmission the world watched wasn't the original footage captured on the moon. The signal was first sent to a station in Australia, then converted, and only afterward retransmitted to the rest of the planet. But wait, why was this conversion necessary? Could this extra step have allowed for possible edits before the public saw anything? And here's something few people question. By the 1960s, cameras with much better quality than what we saw in the official broadcast already existed. The footage aired on TV was grainy, distorted, and low definition. But why? Was the equipment used in Apollo 11 really incapable of capturing better images? Or did someone want to ensure that no suspicious details could be analyzed later? The questions only continued to grow. Lost audio recordings, altered videos, cut transmissions. Was this just a series of innocent technical failures, or the greatest editing job in human history? In the 1960s, the world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not just a military standoff. It was a battle for technological, political, and ideological supremacy. And within this silent war, the space race became the perfect battleground to prove to the world who was truly in control. But given the immense pressure to beat the Soviets, could the United States have staged the moon landing? The Soviet Union was already ahead. They were the first to launch a satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. They were the first to send a man into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. Every Soviet achievement was a humiliation for the United States. And then suddenly, in just 8 years, the Americans not only caught up, but also reached the moon first. How did the US achieve such a massive leap in such a short time? NASA was founded in 1958, and in 1961, President John F. Kennedy boldly announced that the US would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. But here's an important detail. When Kennedy made that promise, NASA didn't even have the technology to keep an astronaut in orbit for more than a day. So how could they be absolutely certain they would reach the moon before the deadline? And now comes the most delicate question. The Soviets never tried to expose the moon landing as a hoax. If the US had truly lied, wouldn't the Soviet Union have been the first to call them out? But what if, behind the scenes, there was an agreement? Some researchers believe that, to prevent the Cold War from escalating further, both countries may have reached a quiet consensus, allowing the lie to go unchallenged to maintain the balance of power. Another suspicious point is the enormous amount of money involved. The Apollo project cost the equivalent of over $150 billion in today's value. Where did all that money go? How much was actually spent on technology, and how much might have been used to finance an elaborate staged production? And there's more. As soon as the US won the space race by landing on the moon, interest in lunar missions suddenly faded. After only a few Apollo missions, the program was shut down, and no other country has set foot on the moon since. How is it possible that, with all our modern technology, no nation has replicated this achievement in over 50 years? With each analysis, the contradictions become more glaring. Was the moon landing a genuine triumph for humanity, or a political maneuver designed to prove that the US was the undisputed leader of the Cold War? The arrival of humans on the moon was one of the most iconic moments in history. But between inconsistent shadows, missing transmissions, a flag waving in the vacuum, and NASA's strange silence on certain details, what really happened on that mission? Was it a legitimate achievement, or the greatest deception ever staged? If Apollo 11 truly landed on the moon, why do so many questions remain unanswered? Why did the documents disappear? Why have we never gone back? The truth may be hidden in secret archives, lost in time, or perhaps it has been visible all along, masked by a web of lies so carefully constructed that few dare to question it. Did mankind reach the moon, or did they just make the world believe it? This story is just one piece of the puzzle, and one day, maybe you'll see the whole picture. If this made you think, subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. After all, more voices mean more discoveries.